1930s was to be the golden age of the airship. Its master, Zeppelin chief Hugo Eckener. In the wake of the record-breaking Graf Zeppelin would come the largest flying machine yet built, the Hindenburg. But Eckener's masterpiece was to be pressed into service by the Nazi regime. And destroyed in one of the most baffling and controversial catastrophes of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 1930s, only Germany and America remained in the airship business. Britain's most technologically advanced airship, the R-101, had crashed in France en route to India. 48 men were killed, including Air Minister Lord Thompson. The loss ended Britain's plans for a fast imperial air service, linking her dominions, and confirmed the worst fears of critics, that airships were unreliable, uncommercial, and unsafe. Zeppelin chief Hugo Eckener disagreed vehemently. His company had built more than 100 airships for military and commercial use. And outside of war, no passenger had ever been injured, let alone killed on a Zeppelin. His groundbreaking flight around the world in the Graf Zeppelin in 1929 demonstrated the potential of the airship as a long-range aircraft.
The 1929 round-the-world flight of the Graf Zeppelin was the crowning achievement in Hugo Eckener's plan to prove to the world that the Zeppelin airship was the perfect, safe, and reliable way to carry people and cargo between the continents.
Eckener set out to raise finance for an international airship line. But with the world reeling from the Wall Street crash, he found it impossible to find backers.
I suppose the time was wrong in the sense that this was the time of the Great Depression. The idea of anybody putting something into what the press was so keen on calling gas bags was just wrong.
Zeppelin's saving grace was its partnership with the American rubber and tire manufacturer Goodyear, based in Akron, Ohio. In 1928, Goodyear Zeppelin won an $8 million contract to build 2 huge airships for the US Navy. It was designed by Carl Einstein, who moved to Akron with 12 other Zeppelin designers and engineers. Its hemispherical doors were revolutionary, eliminating turbulence that could damage airships entering or leaving the dock. By 1930, construction was well underway on the first of the airships, soon to be named Akron. With the economic crash reverberating around the country, hundreds of unemployed men found jobs constructing the largest flying machine yet conceived. But At almost 800 feet long and with a gas capacity of 6.5 million cubic feet, she dwarfed the Graf Zeppelin. Akron was the first airship especially designed for helium rather than highly explosive hydrogen gas.
Airships in Europe were inflated with hydrogen, which has its risks of going up in flames. But the United States was uniquely positioned in having helium, which was a safe inert gas, which didn't burn. And it was considered among many circles as the perfect lifting gas for airships. You didn't have to run the risk of fire anymore on large airships, which was also a psychological disincentive to passenger airships.
They do things in a big way out here. This mammoth Zeppelin dock in Akron, which we see from the air, houses the new queen of the skies. And everybody from miles around is coming to see the Navy's giant Zepp. There's standing room only inside as the crowd gazes on the silver sky battleship.
The 8th of August 1931 was declared a public holiday in Akron. It was the day Mrs. Hoover, wife of the American president, came to christen what one journalist called the biggest flying contraption in the world.
The Akron's crew is at attention, and the crowd surges closer so that it won't miss a thing, for they're getting that thrill that comes once in a lifetime.
The Akron and her sister ship Macon, now under construction, were to be deployed as scouts for the battle fleets of the US Navy. Their ability to travel long distances at high speed would enable them to observe enemy fleet movements. Another striking innovation enhanced their range, the ability to retrieve planes while in flight, making them the world's first aircraft carriers of the skies.
And with the American ability to make everything as complicated as possible, they decided they would carry not just one or two such planes, but would have the capability to carry as many as 5 of them.
During scouting missions, the planes could be launched and retrieved by their mothership in flight. In this way, the eyes of the fleet would be extended thousands of square miles.
Of course, in those years, there was no radar. These airplanes would spot these and radio back to the mothership, which would radio back to the fleet.
So the Akron and Macon had incorporated into their lower hull behind the control car a very large airplane hangar with a retractable door. And then once a plane was retrieved and brought up into the hangar bay, it could be shunted off into one of the 4 corners by a trolley system. Initially, they thought they would hang one plane from the trapeze themselves, but they thought better of that when they realized that if that plane became incapacitated for any reason, they would have to literally chop it off the trapeze so that they could, and lose it so that they could launch the other planes. So in practice, they only carried 4 at a time at any one time.
The naval hierarchy did not always appreciate that the airship was largely an experimental platform at this stage, and that there were teething troubles and certain periods of evolution that would have to be gone through before the airship could deliver on its performance. One of the problems was a great many things were promised of the airship, and now that the massive expenditures had been made, people wanted to see results. And it was in this type of an environment that Admiral Moffett often complicated things by sending the airships on publicity missions rather than actually forcing them to go out to sea and develop tactics for operating with the fleet.
Movie Tone shows you for the first time how passengers on board the Akron see the sights from an observation cabin as the giant cruiser starts to make her initial voyage over the big city with her engines roaring and beating.
Wherever she went, the Akron attracted publicity. but not always the sort Admiral Moffat desired.
In 1932, while she was attempting to moor, a gust of wind swept her skyward so suddenly that 3 men of her ground crew were pulled high into the air. The grip of one man loosened, and he fell to his death. The second man followed him to destruction, but the third crewman hung on and was saved.
This was all caught on newsreel film, and the newsreels had the rather sickening effect on the American public of watching men die. It was the beginning of the American public perhaps thinking that maybe Zeppelin fever wasn't such a good disease to have.
In early April 1933, after 18 months in operation, the Akron left Lakehurst on a mission over the Atlantic Ocean to calibrate radio direction finders. She would not return.
The trip was kind of pushed by those in the Naval Service who felt that the ship's crew needed to get more flying time in, and Admiral Moffat unwittingly helped make sure the ship would fly by deciding he would go on board just for the fun of flying it. He enjoyed flying on the big Ridgets.
Around midnight, Akron was caught in a violent storm. At full speed she hit turbulent air, lost altitude, and her tail smashed into the sea.
Unfortunately, the Akron got caught in what nowadays might be considered a microburst, and since they only flew a few hundred feet above the water, a strong downgust, it's believed, pushed the stern of the airship into the Atlantic, and it was a catastrophe that the airship could not recover from.
While investigations into the tragedy were getting underway, Atlantic Shipping joined naval craft in the search for the lost Akron. High seas on the spot where the huge dirigible crashed buffeted the smaller boats.
It was more tragic that there were no life vests on board, and of the 76 crew member, there were only 3 survivors. The remaining died of drowning and exposure in the cold North Atlantic.
A similar fate was to befall Akron's sister ship, Macon. In February 1935, the Macon was returning to Sunnyvale, California, after exercises with the Pacific Fleet. She met with fog, rain, and low visibility, and was then struck with a severe gust of wind. A newsreel company horrified audiences across America, using dramatic license to show what happened next. All but 2 of the 83 men on board were rescued. The catastrophe was put down to the fact that structural reinforcements at the rear of the airship had not been completed before the mission. 70 years on, her wreckage off Point Sur, California, is stark testimony to the demise of America's rigid airship program. In the early 1930s, the Graf Zeppelin remained the most successful long-distance aircraft in the world. But Hugo Eckener knew that he had to keep her in the public eye if his plan for a fleet of Zeppelins flying the globe was ever to be realized. With short passenger and mail-carrying flights throughout Europe, he raised enough money to keep the ship in operation and pay her crew. He also flew the Graf to the Middle East and even made a polar expedition. On board, scientists and 50,000 items of mail, which helped pay for the journey. But Eckener had an even bolder idea. If it worked, there would be benefits not only for his company, but also offer German exporters and importers a commercial edge. His plan? South America. In 1931, Eckener launched the world's first non-stop passenger and mail flights to Brazil. It was a smart commercial decision, but it also had an enormous political impact in a region dominated by France.
And as far as intercontinental travel was concerned, it was South America, in particular Brazil, that was always the target of the Zeppelin company, for a number of reasons. In Brazil in particular, there were German communities. There was the social link. There were also German businesses strongly represented, particularly in Brazil. And then in the background, as far as Germany itself was concerned, there was ever the lurking political influence to make the presence of Germany felt in a part of the world where hitherto France had been preeminent.
French officials reported to Paris of the Graf Zeppelin's stunning success and questioned whether France's massive investment in South America had been in vain, as now the airship commanded the skies over Rio, Buenos Aires and Recife. Wherever Hugo Eckener's flying machine went, it was difficult not to have some political effect. But in coming years, Dr. Eckener himself would become embroiled in a far more serious political game that would ultimately impact upon the entire world.
He was seen as a figure that was independent. He was seen as a figure much respected. But there were those in Germany who resented the fact that he was seeking, as they saw it, to fly not only the airship, but the ship of state.
In Berlin, politics began to move from the debating chamber onto the streets. Germany was being torn between Hitler's National Socialists on the right and the Communists on the left. Hugo Eckener argued for a middle way.
He spoke out against both extremes, so that in due course it was perhaps no surprise when at least one newspaper headlined the question, after Hindenburg, President of Germany, will it be Hitler or will it be Eckener? And it was this one newspaper article, probably more than anything else, which created in the mind of Hitler a downright opposition to, even hatred of Dr. Eckener.
In January 1933, it was Hitler, not Eckener, who was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The new Führer stepped up German rearmament, and Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels appealed to the population's desire to regain their national pride. To help inspire his countrymen, Goebbels turned to the one internationally acclaimed symbol of German greatness, the Zeppelin.
If you wanted something that was particularly German, then the airship was it. And you combine it too with its shape. It's a symbol of modernity. And I think the airship did become a symbol of German modernity, which got into the German psyche.
Hitler had no love of Echner and no love of the airship, but he understood its potential as a propaganda instrument. To come was one of the most dramatic and controversial chapters in aviation history. In the summer of 1934, the Nazi government supplied funds to the Zeppelin Company to speed up construction of an airship being built at Friedrichshafen. She was to be massively larger and more luxurious than any before her, and would become the most infamous of all, the Hindenburg. At 800 feet in length, she was almost as long as the Titanic. The massive structure weighed 242 tons and relied on lightweight girders made from the aluminium alloy duralumin. Designed for North Atlantic air travel, her hold could carry thousands of mail items and even a motor car or a small plane. Up to 60 crew were quartered along the main keel, and her 50 passengers were accommodated in 25 cabins, all with hot and cold running water. With separate dining, lounge and writing rooms, Hindenburg's passenger space and amenities still remain unmatched on today's aircraft.
It was on the brink of realizing every dream that Echner had ever had for it. They had the ideal ship to be the prototype of a passenger ship of the future, the LZ-129 Hindenburg.
But there was one disappointment for Hugo Echner. Rather than helium gas, Hindenburg would be filled with volatile hydrogen, all 7 million cubic feet of it. America, the world's only supplier of helium, didn't want to give up either its commercial or military advantage. Echner's ambitious rival within the company, Ernst Lehmann, endorsed the Nazis' response to America's rebuff.
Lehmann said, even if the United States would sell us helium for our new airship, the Hindenburg, we wouldn't want it, because this is the day of the greater Third Reich, and we are not dependent on any other nation for anything, and we're going to show the world that that's the way it is.
And show the world they did. With the new national symbol emblazoned on her vertical fins, the Hindenburg finally emerged from her hangar in March 1936. The world's largest aircraft would be a floating advertisement both for Germany's superior technology and the Third Reich.
Within a matter of weeks of it emerging from its hangar, Hindenburg and along with the Graf Zeppelin was chartered by Propaganda Minister Goebbels to fly the length and breadth of Germany, dropping leaflets, playing martial music, relaying speeches from specially installed loudspeakers, all enjoining the population to vote in favour of Hitler's policy of remilitarization of the Rhineland.
Next, it was used for the Olympic Games in 1936. This was a huge showcase for Hitler for the new order. The Hindenburg made a flight over the opening ceremonies to show the flag and welcome the world to Berlin for the Olympics.
The chartering of the airships for propaganda infuriated Eckener, but how they were used was now beyond his control. Flight operations had been taken over by a government company, jointly managed by Eckener's protege and now Nazi sympathizer, Captain Ernst Lehmann. Adding insult to injury, during a flight on the Hindenburg to Rio, Eckener received disturbing news from a reporter on board. Goebbels had banned the German press from mentioning his name for his disparaging comments about the Nazi regime. Hugo Eckener considered seeking political asylum in America rather than live under Hitler, but he decided to stay in Germany to do what he could to save his company and his airships. In her first season, the Hindenburg proved herself a wonderful success. As well as businessmen, her passenger list often boasted millionaires, diplomats, and show business personalities. 1,700 passengers voyaged on 7 return flights from Frankfurt to Rio, and 10 across the North Atlantic to America. International travel by airship was a concept whose time had come.
Most of the passengers on the North Atlantic route were American nationals. They paid in United States dollars, vital to the National Socialist regime, who needed to use such dollars for the import of strategically important raw materials.
The Hindenburg being the first airship that was large enough to carry enough fare-paying passengers that it had the possibility of earning its keep. So the Hindenburg is a very significant airship in that it showed the way by which a commercial operator actually could make money return on the investment.
In early May 1937, the Hindenburg underwent final preparations for a flight to America. Much was riding on her ability to stick to her schedule and arrive on time.
Until it could demonstrate a regular scheduled service, neither France nor Great Britain would sign up for a mail contract, and neither would the business community come to rely upon the ship, who had deadlines to meet.
But in a matter of days, the world's largest aircraft would be destroyed in one of the most infamous disasters of the 20th century. Werner Franz was a cabin boy on that flight.
I was looking after the officers and the captain on board. I served the officers their breakfast, lunch and dinner, and did all the things a steward did for passengers.
Passagieren gemacht.
The fare was $400 one way, the equivalent of the cost of a motor car. But this was by far the most exclusive way to cross the North Atlantic. On board was the largest family group yet to fly on the Hindenburg, the Derners. How Derners' home movies would become a remarkable record of a young family's last fateful journey together. Throughout the flight, the Hindenburg battled headwinds and was forced to detour to avoid storms. But even in rough weather, passengers were struck by the steadiness of the ship.
Auch die Fahrt an sich, die war ja so ruhig.
The trip was so smooth, it was as if one was sitting at the table
Sich bewegt.
or moving around at home.
Schwankungen oder
There was no swaying or turbulence that I noticed.
By the time she reached New York, the Hindenburg was seriously behind schedule. Her landing at nearby Lakehurst was delayed even further when news came through that a thunderstorm was lingering in the vicinity. Just after 7 p.m., she made her final approach.
das Schiff hat in einer Höhe
The ship prepared for landing at a height of 80 meters. The mooring lines were dropped as usual.
kurz nachdem die Tower auf dem Boden aufgeschlagen.
Shortly after the ropes hit the ground, there was a big shaking on the ship.
Bursting into flames. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's Bernie bursting into flames. It's one of the worst catastrophes in the world. All the humanity, all the person feeling around it. I told you, I can't talk to people. There's prison out there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry.
Ich habe mich auf den Aufstieg.
I sat down and stamped my feet through the gangway till I saw the ground coming up towards me through the hole, and I jumped out.
Und in dieser Zeit ist
In these moments, my life just rushed past me like in a film.
und war so aufgewühlt, dass ich da
I was so agitated that I broke into hysteria and just ran away.
And so we ran towards the ship, and we got up to the passenger compartment. There was a couple of passengers still in there, and this other sailor and I, we told them it's time to get out. We told them to get moving. I saw one man jump out of the nose up there at least 500 feet. He jumped out, and he got killed. And the man stayed in there when he got out of the ship. He stayed until it hit the ground, and he walked out. All he had on was his shoes. It was burnt from his heels right up to hair. Everything was gone, skin, clothes, and everything.
In all the history of air disasters, this is the worst, the most terrible. Hailed as the luxury liner of the air, the Hindenburg's horrible end has shocked the entire world.
In all, 36 people lost their lives. 62 survived, including cabin boy Werner Franz. Of the Derner family, father and daughter perished. Thousands came to the quayside at New York to pay their respects. Questions were being asked. Was it sabotage? An attack on the Third Reich? Hugo Eckener sailed from Germany to give evidence at the inquiry into the disaster.
Eckener had a very big problem on his hands. He knew that his entire enterprise was now only a few sentences on an official inquiry report against being damaged forever, perhaps to the point where it could never recover.
There were many theories put to the inquiry, but in its conclusion, the Commission agreed with Eckener that the ship was leaking hydrogen and a spark of static electricity caused the volatile gas to ignite.
So the cause of the accident may have been a spark here or a spark there, but the background to the whole thing was the need to demonstrate a commercial service. It had but a short turnaround time available to it, and waiting passengers included those anxious to attend the coronation in London. Luftschiff Kapitän Pruss, who had been in charge of the landing, was under pressure from the ground, saying, "Land now." He did so, and that was the result.
It was the first time that cameras had been present to record one of these ships being destroyed as it happened. In the newsreels, they got to see people running out of the wreckage with white-hot light behind them, obviously burning them as they ran. People who were not used to this sort of thing at all, as we are today, started to scream in the newsreel theaters as they watched the Hindenburg burn. Got to see the largest aircraft in the world destroyed in the little time of 30 seconds, utterly and completely destroyed. The airship as a viable thing received a death blow that day.
The news of the Hindenburg's demise rocked Friedrichshafen, her birthplace. This was a company town whose lifeblood was the airship. What would become of it now? For the image-conscious Nazi government, the crash was a major embarrassment. But rather than abandon the airship, the government declared it would push to re-establish air services between Germany and the United States. Already under construction was the Hindenburg's sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin II. Insurance money from the Hindenburg disaster helped fund her completion. Eckener headed for Washington to appeal to Congress to allow the export of helium gas to Germany for the new ship. His request received a sympathetic hearing. But with the first gas cylinders about to be shipped from Texas, Hitler's foreign policy brought everything to a halt. In March 1938, German troops annexed Austria for the Third Reich. On hearing the news, the American government refused to allow the export of the helium to Germany. With only hydrogen available, the Graf Zeppelin II was destined never to carry passengers. Instead, she would be used for propaganda flights over Germany and spying missions over Europe and the British coast. On September 1st, 1939, Luftwaffe dive bombers began the Nazi Blitzkrieg assault on Poland, an event which sparked the Second World War. With the coming of war, Germany no longer had any use for its airships. The most famous airship ever, the Graf Zeppelin, and her new namesake were ordered to be broken up, along with their sheds, and melted down to make bombers for the Luftwaffe. After 4 decades of triumph and controversy, the era of the giant Zeppelins was over. It was an inglorious end to Dr. Eckener's dream machine. During the Second World War, no nation possessed large, rigid airships. America, however, relied heavily on the small, non-rigid airship, or blimp.
In 1940, Congress authorized the construction of 48 useful non-rigids to be operated by the Navy. This was a remarkable change almost overnight. From being a lowly stepchild of naval aviation, lighter than air was now going to have a considerable amount of influence in setting up a defensive perimeter around the United States.
Blimps had evolved in the shadow of the giant, rigid-framed airships, and were generally seen as lesser craft. But in the absence of long-range planes, they proved invaluable for reconnaissance and convoy missions.
The location of most enemy submarines was known long before they reached striking distance. But when one was sighted close to a convoy, it immediately set into motion coordinated action of blimps, ships, and combat planes.
$89,000 surface ships were escorted by blimps. During the war, not a single surface ship escorted such was lost to enemy action.
The blimp had proven its worth throughout the war. But at the height of the Cold War, competition for the military dollar saw it fall from favour. By the late 1950s, the US Navy began to disband its airship arm in favour of newly developed long-range aircraft and carrier-based planes. But it was the advent of the jet engine that dashed any hope of resurrecting the airship as a passenger carrier. In the second half of the 20th century, the only airships in operation were used as advertising billboards, or for broadcasting and surveillance, where other aircraft were impractical. Today, the large, rigid airship has been relegated to history, a technology that has little relevance in the modern world. And while it's doubtful we will ever see airships such as the Hindenburg or the Graf Zeppelin again, a new generation of designers is attempting to harness the unique properties of lighter-than-air gas. Some have been spurred on by cheaper fuel costs, others entranced by the ability to fly to inaccessible places. An American-designed cargo-carrying airship called Helistat first took to the air in the 1980s. It was driven by 4 helicopter engines. But as this home movie testifies, Helistat was destined never to develop beyond a prototype. A more sophisticated concept from Germany, called Cargo Lifter, offered the promise of transporting heavy freight to difficult, out-of-the-way places. With 3 times the volume of gas as the Hindenburg, The colossal airship was designed to carry 160 tons, up to 6,000 miles without landing. But in 2002, the project failed after it was beset with financial difficulties.
The problem is that there wasn't a customer there with the deep pockets necessary to fund something like this. And when you look at the history of airships, there's always been either a government or a large corporation with a reason for these ships to exist, funding them and seeing to it that they did exist.
There is, however, an airship revolution in the making. A revolution, some say, is in the realm of science fiction. But it has already captured the interest of governments and corporations. Japan Aerospace has designed a huge unmanned airship to hover 20 kilometers above the Earth. The stratospheric platform is to be fitted with electronic equipment for telecommunications, broadcasting and environmental monitoring.
Lighter than air has the real advantage of being a very inexpensive way to achieve altitude. It tends to get overlooked by all of the heavier than air advocates who ignore the fact that you can't get in space cheaper and more effectively than you can with lighter than air.
And it works. The world's first high-altitude airship underwent successful flight testing in August 2003. The airship takes off in a vertical position. In less than 90 minutes, it reaches the stratosphere, and at a fraction of the cost of a rocket. Once the airship's tasks are completed, retrieving it is simple. The ground crew remotely ruptures the top of the ship. With the aid of a parachute, it slowly descends to Earth. The project is ambitious and takes the airship into an exciting new realm. But if the United States has its way, Japan soon won't have the stratosphere all to itself. The most powerful military force on the planet is also developing a stratospheric airship. Designed by Lockheed Martin, the craft will be inflated with more than 5 million cubic feet of helium, making it the fourth largest airship in history.
And the size of the airship itself is pretty impressive. If you can imagine an airship inside a U.S. football stadium, this airship would barely fit.
With a payload of optical and infrared sensors, the airship will play a surveillance role in America's controversial anti-missile defense system. In the event of an attack mounted against the United States, the airship would provide critical early warning and tracking information to trigger and guide an anti-missile response. The Pentagon believes the project is so promising, it has invested heavily in the next stage of development. If the mammoth craft is ever built, the United States will join Japan, spearheading the greatest technological advance yet seen in the airship story. In the early 21st century, people moving airships are also returning to the skies. At Friedrichshafen, a new generation of Zeppelins has been developed for tourism. Using aerospace materials, they are the first airships since the days of the Hindenburg to be built with an internal structure.
Today in Germany, for a couple $100, you can get a flight for an hour in one of the new Zeppelin airships around the area of the Swiss Alps. The Germans have now built 3 of the new Zeppelin-type airships.
The future lies with tourism, whereby people can make short flights to enjoy the countryside. And here the market will be for the very rich and perhaps the not so rich, who as a lifetime experience want to savour what it must have been like to travel on the Graf Zeppelin or the Hindenburg.
And there is an even more ambitious plan for the modern Zeppelin. A fleet of large airships connecting 10 cities throughout Europe. Each ship will carry 40 passengers and their luggage. Critics, however, question whether a fleet of slow-moving airships could be financially viable in skies now dominated by jet aircraft. But as Count von Zeppelin proved more than a century ago, the potential of the airship lies not with skeptics, but with visionaries. The lighter-than-air machine is a ship of dreams, which casts a spell not only on its passengers, but anyone who's ever witnessed the world's largest flying machines take to the sky.
I think the most important thing about the airships is the people. The technology changed over the years, but something that remained a constant was the determination, the vision, the feeling, and the soul that went into the development and flying of these craft. There has probably never been any other type of aircraft that has evoked so much emotion, so much feeling from the heart, so much appeal to man's wish to dream.